If you have ever had to deal with an overbearing HOA, a nasty neighbor, or anyone who tries to control your life with unreasonable rules, this story is for you. Don't let anyone force you to live your life the way they want. You have the right to decide your space, your life, and you can stand up to those who abuse your power. I did it. I took back my freedom in my own home. And you can do it too. Don't forget to like, share, or follow so you don't miss out on interesting stories. Now, let's explore the story with Nahu. I never thought moving to a new neighborhood would be such a terrible mistake. When I signed the contract to buy this house, I had only one thought in mind: finally, I could escape the stuffy city. After years of living in cramped apartment buildings, enduring honking horns and hours-long morning traffic jams, I believed that Lakewood would be a new beginning, a place where I could breathe fresh air without being woken up by the noise of the city. The neighborhood looked like something out of an architectural magazine, houses built in a uniform style, with clean stone driveways and neat white picket fences surrounding lush green courtyards. A small lake sat at the center of the neighborhood, where on quiet afternoons I could imagine myself strolling, enjoying the pale yellow of the setting sun. Everything here seemed suspiciously perfect. When I arrived at my new home, the neighbors seemed friendly. Some greeted me from a distance, and a few stopped to ask about the move. But despite the friendly smiles, I felt like there was a layer of mist lurking behind those greetings, something unclear, as if they were waiting to see if I would really fit in. But maybe it was just my imagination, or I just wasn't used to the new environment. I began unpacking, organizing my home, and enjoying the privacy I'd always craved. It felt great to know that I could walk around the house without worrying about my upstairs neighbors or having to endure arguments through the paper-thin walls. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until I received my first letter from the HOA. A white envelope, unusually thick for a welcome letter, landed neatly in my mailbox. When I opened it, I found a thick document with bold letters on the first page: Lakewood Residential Household Rules and Regulations. I raised an eyebrow, wondering how a small neighborhood could have so many rules that it required a manual. But it wasn't until I flipped through the pages that I realized how ridiculous it all was. The document was over 20 pages long, with a number of incredibly detailed stipulations. No parking on the street for more than 3 hours. No planting of any kind other than those approved by the HOA. The front door had to be painted one of 5 specified colors. Even the number of holiday lights hung on the porch had to be within a certain standard. The more I read, the more I felt like I had signed a contract with the devil. I shook my head, put the papers aside, and told myself that these rules were probably just a formality, and no one really cared. How could such a beautiful place be run by such an absurdly tight control apparatus? I wasn't the type to cause trouble or challenge authority. I just wanted to live peacefully in my new home. But I was wrong. In Lakewood, rules are not just a formality, but a tool of control held by Karen, the HOA president. Just a week after moving in, I received a series of warning letters: trash cans left out 30 minutes early, curtains the wrong color. At first I thought these were just strict requirements, until I saw that each violation was accompanied by a $25 fine. The rules here are not meant to maintain order or improve the neighborhood, but to consolidate Karen's absolute power, forcing residents to obey unconditionally. The more I learned about how HOAs operate, the more annoyed I became. They have a list of colors that are allowed for doors, and anyone who violates them must repaint them immediately. A house 3 doors down from me was forced to replace its door because the wood color didn't match. Another neighbor was fined for planting tulips that the HOA deemed too bright and disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. People here are not just afraid of the HOA, they are actually afraid of Karen. Not only is she the HOA president, she controls everything. Karen patrols like a police officer, observing every little detail, taking notes in a thick notebook. Violation? A warning letter and a fine the next day. Resistance? Karen escalates immediately to the police, calls a tow truck, and even hires someone to repaint the house of anyone who doesn't comply with the rules. Karen's power over Lakewood is like that of a dictator. Everything has to be perfect according to her standards. One morning, I saw a neighbor repainting her faded fence. They just wanted a little touch-up, but less than an hour later, Karen showed up with a stack of documents. I couldn't hear the conversation, but a few days later, the fence was repainted a different color, and it was definitely not the homeowner's choice. I was starting to feel frustrated. This was not the life I had hoped for when I moved to Lakewood. I had expected peace, but instead, everything was tightly controlled by Karen, who no one dared to challenge. But I wasn't like them. I had no intention of bowing to these unreasonable rules. Looking at the small garden in front of my house, I had a simple idea: plant flowers. Just flowers, right? Little did I know that decision would set off a war of words between me and the HOA. In Lakewood, even the smallest things can become an issue, especially when they're not on Karen's list of rules. I chose sunflowers. They're not fussy plants, they don't require much care, but they're hardy. I bought a few packets of seeds from the garden store in town, and one morning I rolled up my sleeves and dug in the dirt and planted the seeds on my porch. It felt strangely liberating, like I was asserting my small freedom in this neighborhood full of restrictive rules. Over the next few days, I spent watering and watching each new sprout emerge from the soil. It was so wonderful to see the little garden take shape. I almost forgot that I was breaking HOA rules. But Karen didn't. 3 days after the first sprouts appeared, I received a warning letter from the HOA. It was the same white envelope that had been stuffed into my mailbox before, but this time, the content of the letter made me laugh. According to HOA regulations, all front yard plants must be on an approved plant list. Sunflowers are not on that list. Please remove them within 48 hours to avoid penalties. I read the words over and over again, trying to find a valid reason for this absurd law, but there was none. There was no reason why sunflowers, a beautiful, harmless flower that didn't affect anyone, should be banned. I didn't plant any weeds, let the grass grow wild, or do anything that would ruin the neighborhood. All I did was add a little bright yellow to my front porch. But to Karen, that seemed like an act of rebellion. Of course, I ignored the letter. I didn't pull the sunflowers, didn't respond to the warning, and continued to water them every day. The flowers grew strong, reaching up into the sunlight, a silent protest against the unreasonable rules the HOA imposed on every corner of the neighborhood. But Karen wouldn't give up so easily. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This time the tone was stronger. HOA rules are not for compromise. If the sunflowers are not removed within the next 24 hours, you will be cited under the landscaping violation. I crumpled the letter. This wasn't about sunflowers anymore. It was about power. Karen wouldn't take kindly to anyone who dared to disobey her rules. But I wasn't one to be cowed, so I decided to leave the flower bed alone. If Karen thought she could intimidate me with a meaningless ticket, she was wrong. I wanted to see how far she would go, and I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, when I opened the door to get the paper, I found a new HOA letter in the mailbox, this time a $500 fine with the cold reason: landscaping violation, unauthorized planting. I looked at that number, both amused and angry. $500 just for a flower bed. Not for littering, not for making noise at night, but for daring to plant flowers without HOA approval. Did they really think that would get me to budge? I didn't pay the fine. I crumpled the paper, threw it in the trash, and moved on with my life. My sunflowers still stood there, proud, growing taller every day in the sun. But Karen wasn't going to let it go. 2 days later, another envelope arrived, this time with a more aggressive tone. She threatened to sue me, saying that if I didn't pay the fine, the HOA would have the right to take me to court for violation of the residential lease. I wasn't surprised anymore. I understood how Karen operated around here. She didn't just want everyone to follow the rules, she wanted everyone to be completely subservient to her. As before, I ignored her. A week passed, and just when I was starting to think that Karen might have given up, she decided to take things further. That morning I was working in the house when I heard a loud knock on the door. When I opened it, I didn't expect to see the police at my door. 2 officers in neat uniforms, neutral but professional in their expressions, looked at me and said they had received a call from the HOA about me being disruptive and not following the neighborhood rules. For a moment, I didn't know whether to be angry or to laugh. Karen had actually called the police over a patch of sunflowers. I politely explained the situation, saying that I was just planting a few flowers in my yard and that the HOA was being overly controlling. One of the officers glanced at the small front garden, then looked back at me with almost pity. They clearly didn't want to be there, and I could tell they had been brought in for protocol. They exchanged a few words, then said that this wasn't their area of responsibility. No one was breaking the law here. Karen had failed. I stood there, watching them leave, and I realized something important. Karen had no real power. She could enforce AA rules, she could send warning letters, she could threaten to sue, but all of that would only work if I complied. And I didn't. I didn't pull the flowers. I didn't pay the fines. And more importantly, I knew Karen was losing control. She was used to being feared, used to giving orders and being obeyed. But I wasn't like them. I had decided that if this was going to be a fight, I was going to play it out. I thought that after the police left, Karen would realize she had gone too far and admit defeat. But I was wrong. She wouldn't give up. If she couldn't use a fine to make me pull out the flowers, if she couldn't use the police to scare me, then Karen would choose another method. A more subtle method. She started following me. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but no, it wasn't an illusion. Every morning when I opened the door to water the flower beds, I would see a figure in the distance, standing in front of her house or wandering around on the sidewalk. It was always just for a few minutes, long enough for me to realize she was watching me, then pretending to be busy doing something. One time I saw her standing on the lawn, her phone raised to take a picture of my yard. At first I tried to ignore it, but then the HOA emails started coming. This time, Karen didn't send me paper letters anymore, but emails came directly to my inbox. Every day, always in the morning, I received an email from the HOA. It was nothing new, an exact copy of the previous warnings, asking me to remove the sunflowers, reminding me that I was violating the neighborhood landscaping regulations. But the difference was that each email included a photo of my yard, taken from different angles, clearly taken by Karen herself. Every day I was reminded that she was watching me. But she didn't stop there. One evening I left the house for a run around the neighborhood. When I returned, I noticed something strange on my doorstep. Another flower letter, but this time it wasn't in the mailbox. It was taped to my front door. I pulled it down, looked at the bold letters, final warning, flower will take enforcement measures. I clenched the paper in my hand. I knew what Karen was playing at. She wanted me to feel threatened. She couldn't make me pay the fine. She couldn't get the police involved. but she could apply constant pressure, wearing down my patience day by day, making me pluck the flowers myself just to end this farce. But again, she had misjudged me. If she thought I would succumb to such petty tricks, she didn't know me at all. I didn't pull the flowers. I didn't respond to emails. I didn't change a thing. And that's when Karen lost her patience completely. She stopped taking pictures from afar. She started getting closer. One morning, I walked outside and saw a small scrawl in the ground, right next to the flower bed. Someone had been messing with my garden. I had no proof, but I knew who it was. Karen was no longer just watching. She was ready to take action, and so was I. I knew Karen wouldn't stop, but I didn't think she'd be so desperate as to do it herself. After I noticed the small dent in the soil, I became more cautious. I started paying closer attention when I went outside and checking my flower beds more often. Everything seemed fine for the next few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had tried to sabotage my garden and might come back to finish the job. So one weekend night, I decided to stay up late to keep watch. I turned off all the lights in the house and pulled the curtains just a little, making it look like I was asleep. Then I sat by the window and waited. At first, I felt a little silly. Who would be stalking a gardener in the middle of the night? But I was right to do so. Around 1 in the morning, I saw a stealthy figure appear outside my yard. In the dim light from the street lamp, I recognized Karen's short blonde hair. She was wearing a dark outfit, trying to move as quietly as possible so as not to make any noise. But what made my blood boil more than anything was that she held a small shovel in her hand, and she was kneeling next to my flower bed. My heart was pounding. I couldn't believe my eyes. Karen had actually pulled my sunflowers. I didn't hesitate any longer. I walked quickly to the door, unlocking it as quietly as possible. When I was sure she didn't know I was standing there, I abruptly turned on the porch light and stepped outside. Karen jumped, frozen in place like a child who had just been caught stealing. For the first few seconds, she just stood there, eyes wide, her hand still clutching a flower that had just been plucked from the ground. There was a look of confusion in her eyes, as if she was quickly trying to justify her actions. But I didn't give her a chance to speak first. I stepped closer, looking straight at her. I didn't scream, I didn't curse. I simply stood there, silent, staring straight at the person who had just vandalized my property. And that was probably scarier than any verbal abuse. Karen began to stutter, trying to come up with a plausible story. She said she was just landscaping, that she had the right to do so under the HOA rules. But we both knew that was a blatant lie. There was no HOA rule that gave her the right to come into my private yard in the middle of the night to remove plants. I clenched my fists and took a deep breath. I didn't want to lose my temper, but the anger was boiling inside me. Karen had sent warning letters, threatened to sue, called the police, and now she was personally vandalizing my property. This was no longer just a fight between a resident and an HOA. It was a blatant trespass. I pulled out my phone. Not to call Karen, not to argue, but to call the police. Karen saw it immediately. Her face was white, her eyes wide as if she finally understood that she had gone too far. She stammered something, trying to justify herself, but I didn't care anymore. I held the phone in my hand, my finger ready to dial. And just as I had predicted, Karen panicked and ran. Karen threw down the shovel, threw the flowers she had just plucked to the ground, and ran home, almost out of breath, as if she had been caught red-handed. I looked down at the flower bed. Some of the flowers had been plucked. The soil had been turned upside down, but most of them were intact. She had not completed her crime. But I had enough evidence to take her down. I did not sleep that night, not out of fear, but out of anger and determination. Karen had thought she could get away with it, that she could act in the dark and no one would dare to oppose her. But she had made the biggest mistake of all. She had messed with the wrong person. The next morning, I didn't hesitate any longer. I checked the security cameras, rewinding each frame to make sure I had the evidence. And as I expected, the footage captured Karen secretly digging in the flower bed in the middle of the night. There was no denying it. Not only that, I had her in every HOA email she sent, the ridiculous citation, and most importantly, the threatening eviction letter taped to my door. I spent the morning gathering the documents, the threatening emails, the ridiculous citation, the photos of Karen stalking me, and most importantly, the video of her trespassing on my property. With each piece of evidence on my computer screen, I felt a surge of satisfaction. Karen had destroyed herself, and my next target was the higher-ups in the HOA. Not only did I sue Karen for trespassing, I also filed a formal complaint with the city's HOA oversight body. This was her weakness. Karen could control Lakewood, but she couldn't control those in power above her. Many people mistakenly think of HOAs as an absolute organization, but in reality they are still subject to oversight from above. I did my research and contacted the city's HOA Oversight Board directly, which has the authority to regulate and intervene when a local HOA abuses its power. I sent in my complaint, along with all the evidence of Karen's blatant abuse of power, not only against me but also against other residents I had researched over the years. I knew I wasn't the only victim. Many people in this neighborhood had been manipulated by Karen with unreasonable rules and unreasonable fines. But no one dared to speak up because they thought they couldn't do anything against her. But I did. A few days later, I received a call from the HOA Board of Supervisors. They said they had started an investigation. But what surprised me was that I wasn't the only one who complained. It seemed like my actions had started a storm. Karen had made too many enemies. Within a week, a wave of residents began to speak out. Those who had lived in fear, who had been fined unjustly, could no longer sit idly by. The wave of complaints spread, and within 10 days, the HOA was inundated with complaints. The upper management had no choice but to step in. Karen must have noticed, because she suddenly went completely silent. No more fine letters. No more threatening emails. No more prying eyes from the house across the street. She disappeared, like a predator realizing it was about to be cornered. But I knew this silence was only temporary. Finally, the fateful day came. Karen was summoned to the HOA board. The hearing took place in a large conference room, where Karen was grilled repeatedly about dozens of alleged violations. When I walked into the room, I saw her sitting there, her face tense and stiff. This was no longer the arrogant, bossy woman I had known. This was someone who knew she was headed for failure. She tried to justify herself, tried to spin the situation, but in the face of overwhelming evidence, her defense fell apart. The unreasonable fines, the surveillance of residents, the threatening emails, all came crashing down. And most importantly, when the council played the video of her surreptitiously vandalizing my flower beds, I saw her face pale. There was no room for denial. Some council members stared, others shook their heads in frustration. I could feel the atmosphere in the room change completely. Then came a series of accusations from other residents. A middle-aged man told of how Karen had fined him for installing flashing lights at Christmas. An elderly woman said that Karen had threatened to repaint her front door at her own expense because the color was not harmonious enough. Story after story, and the more the council listened, the more impatient they became. Karen continued to try to justify herself, but her every word was refuted by concrete evidence. Her every action was brought to light. Karen had no choice but to back down. The result? She was fired immediately. But I wasn't done. A simple removal wasn't enough. I filed a lawsuit against her for trespassing and vandalism. This time, Karen couldn't hide. She had gone from being the HOA dictator to just another person, facing real consequences. No more power, no more control over the neighborhood, and most importantly, no more control over me. But that wasn't the end. She may have lost her job, but I didn't forget the trespassing lawsuit. I followed the case closely, and within weeks, Karen was officially ordered to pay damages. A powerful former HOA president was now forced to bow to the law. Soon after, her house was listed as for sale. A month later, Karen disappeared from Lakewood, with no one to see her off. As her SUV rolled out of the neighborhood, I knew the battle was over and I had won. When it was all over, I stood on my front porch and took a deep breath. It was a truly peaceful morning. No more threatening letters, no more reminder emails, no more prying eyes from across the street. No one secretly taking pictures of my yard every morning. No one could force me to pull the flowers anymore, because Karen was gone from the neighborhood. And that's why I decided to do something that would have made Karen crazy if she were still here. I planted another sunflower field. I didn't just keep the flowers I already had. I expanded the bed, extending it along the fence, turning it into a sea of yellow. I chose the tallest, most vigorous varieties of sunflowers so they could tower over the surrounding houses. The flowers stretched out to the sun, a silent declaration that I had won, that no one, no matter how tyrannical, could impose control over me on my own land. In the following days, I began to receive recognition from the neighbors. Before, they had only dared to quietly observe, not daring to speak out against the HOA. But now that Karen was gone, when her shadow of power no longer loomed over the neighborhood, they began to step into the light. One morning, as I was watering my flower beds, an elderly woman from the house across the street walked over. She looked at my flowers for a long time, then whispered, "They are beautiful." I have always loved sunflowers, but I never dared to plant them because of her. I smiled, and within a week, I saw the first flowers begin to grow in her front yard. Then another. Then another. Soon, little corners of the neighborhood began to light up with the colors Karen had tried so hard to control for so many years. Lakewood changed. No more unreasonable rules about door colors. No more fines for planting the wrong flowers. The HOA had a new president, someone I could see as more reasonable and fair, no longer controlling every little detail of our lives. And me? I was enjoying my life, the life I had fought for. Every morning I sit on my porch, sip my coffee, watch my sunflowers sway in the wind, listen to the birds chirping in the nearby trees. Nothing bothers me anymore. No more rules. No more unreasonable punishments. Just sunshine, cool breezes, and a sweet sense of victory. Karen wanted to remove all these flowers. But in the end, she was the one who was removed from Lakewood. Have you ever encountered an overbearing HOA like this? If you have ever encountered a Karen in your life, what would you do? Share your story. Let everyone know that we are not alone in our fight against unreasonable control. And if you are struggling with an HOA who likes to impose power, remember, you have the right to speak up, you have the right to fight, and most importantly, you have the right to win. This is not only a story about HOA, but also a lesson about not letting anyone impose on your life. Don't forget to like, share, or click follow. Sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch.